Opening words this morning are from Albert Camus. In order to understand the world, one has to turn away from it on occasion. In order to serve men and women better, one has to hold them at a distance for a time. But where can one find the solitude necessary to vigor, the deep breath in which the mind collects itself and courage gauges its strength? So good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all, good to be together, even though we are separated. Good to take this time to reach inside again, to touch our own sources of strength and courage and imagination, to find the solitude that our spirits need, not to retreat from the world, but to serve it better, to love it more fully, to inhale the deep, deep breath that unites us with all creation. I invite you now to take a candle or a chalice, if you have one at home, and to light your chalice with me as we recite the words that are our affirmation of faith. We light our flaming chalice to illuminate the world we seek. In the search for truth, may we be just. In the search for justice, may we be loving. And in loving, may we find peace. The reading is from another piece of Camus, The Rebel. He says, every great reformer tries to create in history what Shakespeare, Cervantes, and Molière, and Tolstoy knew how to create. A world always ready to satisfy the hunger for human freedom and dignity, which each of us, every man and woman, carries in his or her heart. Beauty, no doubt, does not make revolutions, but a day will come when revolutions have need of beauty. I invite you to join me in a time of meditation. Whatever sorrow there is in this life, help us to bear it together. Whatever happiness can be found, let us share it with one another. Whatever work it takes to make the world more humane, let us labor as one. Whatever hope lights our hearts, let it be for all people. As a single community, let us grieve and rejoice, love and give thanks, and may no one be forgotten. And now in silence, we join in spirit with all those here in New Mexico, in our country, around the world, who suffer or live in fear from this virus. We send our prayers and thanks to all the healers, to all the helpers, to all who lend a hand. Everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world. And yet somehow we find it hard to believe when we find them come crashing down on us out of a clear blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, and yet plagues and wars always take people equally by surprise. So says Albert Camus in his novel, The Plague. Few of us would have guessed a couple of months ago that we would see unemployment soaring up to levels not seen since the Great Depression, that we would see concerts and even political campaigns being canceled, that it would be such a risky adventure even to go to the grocery store. The world it's changed in ways that we wouldn't have imagined a few weeks ago. As Camus says, we were taken by surprise, but if we'd been better students of history, we might have seen a little bit of what was coming. The city of Oran, a rather unromantic shipping port in Algeria, is the scene of Camus' tale. The town's ordinariness is its only distinguishing characteristic. The landscape is unlovely, the architecture is uninspired. It is, Camus says, a place of pebbles, dust, and heat. The citizens, hardworking but unimaginative. Few of them suspected their lives were about to be turned upside down. In the beginning, the authorities denied there was any problem at all, and then it became easy to blame the victims. "You knew Camps, didn't you?" asks one streetcar conductor to another. "Camps? Tall chap with a black mustache? That's him, a switchman." "Yeah, I remember now." "Well, he's dead." "Oh, when did he die?" "After that business with the rats." "You don't say so. What did he die of?" "Can't say exactly. Some kind of fever, of course. He was never what you would call fit." "Still, he didn't look that different from other people." "Well, I wouldn't say that. He had a weak chest, and he used to play the trombone in the town band. It's hard on the lungs playing a big instrument like that." "Wow, if you've got weak lungs, it doesn't do you any good playing a trombone." "What possessed any man to engage in such a dangerous activity is hard to explain," the narrator ironically comments. But by distinguishing their own sensible habits from those of their less fortunate neighbors, many of those who are unaffected manage to perpetuate an illusion of their own immunity. So we heard early on that COVID was a hoax or a political ploy, or it was the Chinese virus that would never reach these shores because we were immune. We were special. We were protected. But when the death toll rose and then continued to rise, it became very hard to sustain the denial, so other stratagems were employed. Father Panalou, for instance, uses the week of prayer to suggest that the plague is God's scourge, a punishment for sin. "Calamity has come on you, brethren," he intones from the pulpit, "and brethren, you deserved it." Religion has so often been used to justify or explain havoc, as with Franklin Graham, advisor to the president, who blames the current pandemic on abortion and gay marriage, America turning its back on God. But as the ravages of the epidemic become increasingly indiscriminate, taking away the rich and the poor, the young and the old, even good Father Panalou starts to waver in his faith. The plague starts to seem less like any divine plan than the absence of any sort of plan at all, just a a blind and senseless assault on human values. Camus was no stranger to the arbitrary nature of life and death. His father, who had been an infantryman, was killed by a shell in the Battle of the Marne, leaving the infant Albert to be raised by his mother, eking out a living as a cleaning woman in Algiers. Despite the poverty of his upbringing, the young Camus distinguished himself as a student, a scholar, an athlete, but he contracted tuberculosis in his 17th year, committing him to a lifetime of spitting blood. It was for his lungs that he left Africa, that he traveled to the mountains of France for the uncontaminated air, but unluckily he left just as the Nazis were laying down their occupation, separating from his wife and forcing him into an involuntary and unexpected exile. Only by subterfuge could he continue his medical treatments, since his doctor, a Jew, was forbidden to practice under the regulations of the Vichy regime in France. And in this climate of encroaching chaos and darkness, Camus began work on his novel. La Peste, the plague, stands not for any single malady, but for all the brute, blind forces that frustrate human hopes and rob people of their dignity. Fascism, war, poverty, stupidity, ethnic hatred. These were all forms of the plague that Camus was intimately familiar with. Everything that dehumanizes and objectifies our neighbor. The walls of indifference, disregard that anesthetize us to the suffering of others. These are the breeding grounds for the germs, for the disease. That's where it grows and flourishes. The small mountain village where Camus lived in France was called Le Chambon. Although he did not realize at the time, Le Chambon was an enclave of Christian resistance to Nazi rule, where hundreds of Jews were being sheltered and protected under the guidance of the local Protestant pastor. For quite different reasons, Camus was also a resistor. He was writing and editing the underground newspaper Combat, even as he worked on his novel. But while Camus wielded his pen against the Nazis, he never wielded a gun, for the same reason that he refused to condone the execution of war criminals after Nuremberg. In his essay, Reflections on the Guillotine, he condemns capital punishment as nothing more than state-sponsored murder of the most cold-blooded and calculated kind. The evil that's in this world always comes of ignorance, he writes in The Plague. The most incorrigible vice being that of an ignorance which fancies that it knows everything, and therefore claims for itself the right to kill. Killing would never seem right to Camus. Death in all its disguises, whether the work of lowly microbes or of men who justified their carnage in the name of some higher cause, would always be for him the enemy, the eternal foe. When Dr. Roux, the protagonist of Camus' novel, who spends himself tirelessly to fight the plague, is asks why he persists in his struggle to cure and comfort and to heal, rather than giving in to the escapism or the fatalism of his peers. He searches for some adequate answer. It's not to serve God, because it's hard to believe in any higher power where plagues happen. It's not because he believes he can finally rid the world of suffering or win a lasting triumph against disease. As a doctor, he knows that the fight is never won. The cures are always temporary. Only, he says, I've never managed to get used to seeing people die. That's all I know. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the saving grace, as long as we never get used to it. So long as we feel touched, diminished in some way by the death of another, whether a friend or a stranger, there is some shred of humanity remaining. And this is what Camus called love without limits, leaving our hearts open to a commonality that knows no barriers of geography or race or class or creed. And yet, compassion fatigue is also a reality. Maybe it's not possible to personally care for every victim. Exhaustion sets in. Camus describes how, after months of being locked down and quarantined from the outside world, the citizens in the walled city of Oran are slowly worn down. They're worn down especially as the holidays draw near. Christmas that year had none of its old associations, he writes. In churches, there were more supplications than carols. You saw a few children, too young to understand the threat, playing in the frosty, cheerless streets, but no one dared bid them welcome in the God of former days, the bringer of gifts. There was no room in any heart for anything but a very old, gray hope, a dogged will to live. And yet doggedness, the survival instinct, does prevail. The plague eventually subsides. And after the war, Camus decided to return to the land of his youth. But he found that land had changed. The world had changed. He had changed. He was something else that he didn't remember. In his essay, Return to Pasa, he recalled the dank dampness of Algiers in December, not the warm, luminous city that he remembered. He haunted the cafes where the faces looked vaguely familiar, like people he'd once known, but no longer quite recalled their names or recognized them. He just saw that their expressions were now more careworn, more beaten down, just like his own. To be sure, it's sheer madness, almost always punished, to return to the sites of one's youth, to try to relive at 40 what one loved or keenly enjoyed at 20, he remarks. And yet, still, he made the attempt to go home. He returned to Pasa, to the town of his birth, which lay some kilometers away from the big city. Pasa was an old place. It had been a Carthaginian port before it was taken over by the Roman legions. It's now a World Heritage Site where the ruins of the old baths with their colonnades and the theaters and the basilicas reach down to the turquoise sea. So despite the poverty of his upbringing. Camus says he had been brought up surrounded by beauty, which was my only wealth. I had begun in plenty, and then had come the barbed wire. I mean, tyrannies, war, police forces, the era of revolt. Resistance had been his whole life, but it had left him drained and depleted. Fighting cruelty and injustice was not enough, he discovered. Even morality was not enough. One also needed awe and adoration and admiration. One needed beauty. He realized to come alive again, one needs a special grace, self-forgetfulness, or a homeland, certain mornings, turning a corner, a delightful dew falls upon the heart and then evaporates, but its coolness remains. And this is what the heart requires always. He says, I discovered once more at Tapasa that one must keep intact in oneself a freshness, a cool wellspring of joy. Love the day that escapes injustice and return to combat having won that light. Here I recaptured former beauty, a young sky, and I measured my luck, realizing that in the worst years of our madness, the memory of that sky had never left me. And this was what in the end had kept me always from despairing. I'd always known the ruins of Tapasa were younger than our new construction or the bomb damage. There the world began over again every day in an ever new light. Oh, light, this is the cry of all the characters of the ancient dramas brought face to face with their fate. This last resort was ours too, and I knew it now. In the middle of winter, I at last discovered there was in me an invincible summer. May we too soon find our way home and into the summer's light. Amen.
Thank you. So it's now time for our sharing of responsibility. And I'm going to read from the book of Galatians, chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time and at the appointed season, we will reap if we do not grow weary. So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of the faith. And speaking of doing good to all people, I just wanted to give you an update on our UCOT cares about Taos. So as of yesterday, May the 2nd, our matching grants fundraiser has reached $8,785 in contributions. Matched with our $5,000, that's a total of $13,785. Two of the donors weren't even members of our church, but thanks to Jim Schultz, who wrote a letter to the editor about it in the Taos News, they contributed. So if you do the math, that's $8,960.25 donated to the St. James Food Pantry, $2,067.75 to El Pueblito's Share Table, and $1,378.50 each to Sin Fronteras and Taos Immigrant Allies. And we received a thank you note from Sherry Lyon of the El Pueblito shared table. And she writes, "Dear friends, thank you for your support, exclamation. Shared Table has seen a 50% increase in families seeking food, and thanks to your generosity, we are able to help meet that need." So that's great news, and we are making an impact in the community. Just also want to remind everyone to not forget to mail in your pledges, and continue to send any monies to the fundraising campaign if you'd like to. The quickest way for it to get to us is mailing it directly to Betty Meyerson, and her address is 810 Dillon, Dillon Lane, 87571, or to the UCOT Post Office Box 510, Taos 87571. So I'd ask everybody who wants to join me in reading the words from the order of service for the extinguishing of the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Which are from The Plague, from Albert Camus. He said, "This is what we learn in times of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in people than to despise."
Oh,
So
very
be
good.
well.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Gary.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Gary.